Tan Sri. Good day, ladies and gentlemen, from wherever you are. It's a pleasure to share some of the accumulated knowledge on palm oil over the years. And today, I've just titled the presentation as very simply as palm oil supports favorable health and nutritional outcomes. Next slide. Now, why are we saying this? Now, if you're looking at the effects of palm oil, you really have to go back to the 1990s when the issue of the effect of dietary oils and fats on cholesterol metabolism was made aware by none other than a famous gentleman, Ansel Keys. And the Keys-Hextad equation that thereafter followed became a mainstay of how the world viewed all oils and fats, particularly saturated fat, simply because this Keys-Hextad equation was able to predict your cholesterol changes, your blood cholesterol changes on a possible increase or decrease of the saturated fat content in your diet. This was countered by the content of polyunsaturated fatty acids in the diet as well. Now, during this period from the 1990s and up to the early 2000, the world has seen changing and soaring incidence of coronary heart disease and then diabetes. Now, as a result, a number of international guidelines have emerged, but all these guidelines have a key or the origin of what is known as the Mcgovern Commission in the United States and headed by a gentleman called Senator Mcgovern. Now, it's very interesting that for 5 decades, this commission's hearing became the mainstay of most of the dietary guidelines, particularly for oils and fats around the world. But unfortunately, what happened was that as a result of these guidelines and the goading from the food industry, particularly in the United States, the world today has seen a new epidemic, not the COVID, not the one that we are going through, but we are already seeing a diabetic epidemic, which is far more worse than the coronary heart disease challenges faced by humans previously. Next slide. Now, what has happened is that in the past 30 years, science has continuously researched the effect of saturated fats in the diet, polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fatty acids. The origin of the fatty acids, as well as the quantity you eat, becomes very important in dictating your plasma cholesterol outputs and therefore your ultimate risk in heart disease. But these well-entrenched documentations took a major turn starting around 2005 and into 2010, when researchers all over the world, particularly those from the Harvard Medical School and elsewhere, began to relook at the data and suddenly realized that what they were looking for could have been an error. Saturated fat content was not being critically associated with the incidence of coronary heart disease and in fact incidence of mortality from coronary heart disease. As you know, coronary heart disease is a multifactorial disease. The risk factors are surmounting every day. Even as I talk, I count about 232 different risk factors. But look at this data. This is a meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And when they put all the major studies that looked into saturated fats and cholesterol metabolism, they found that the association between the intake of saturated fat and risk for coronary heart disease, as well as stroke in the population, could not be carried forward. Next slide. Now, this, next slide, this triggered a number of newer studies, and a number of them are now in the publication. On the left-hand corner, you see a study that came out of the Cambridge University, which actually reflected similar outputs as those from the Harvard Medical School, from Suetonio, etc. And as a result, if you scrutinize the scientific literature, you will see increasing evidence for the fact that saturated fatty acids or saturated fat consumption cannot be directly correlated to the incidence of coronary heart disease in any given population. And therefore, we need to rethink this. Now, if you are interested in reading a little bit more detail in this, I've actually helped CPOPC put up a paper in the Journal of Oil Palm and Oil Palm Research, which is freely downloadable from the CPOPC website. And I will ask you to go and read the details there, please. Next slide, please. Now, what is happening now? Now, if you look at the 2021 US Dietary Guidelines, in the face of all this new evidence, you would have thought that the United States Dietary Guidelines Expert Committee would make the much needed change in advising dietary regimes to the American populations. Unfortunately, the 2021 dietary guidelines appear to reflect the same old concept that was 30, 40 years ago, that you want to reduce your saturated fat intake, increase your polyunsaturated fat, and even substitute it for monounsaturated fatty acids. To harden researchers in the system, this is a bit intriguing, because what the American Heart Association is actually trying to do is still trying to overcome the continued presence of partially hydrogenated fat, trans fatty acids in some of the foods in the American population. On the right, you see the two major studies published in the New England Journal of Medicine that says that well, any quantum of trans fatty acids that you and I consume are a danger, and they must be got rid of. Now, in many ways, palm oil has filled the gap for the partially hydrogenated fats. Next slide. And it is honestly, right now, it is the only dietary fat that can possibly replace partially hydrogenated fats and yet give the functionality to the products that it replaces, such as in margarines, in shortenings, in bakery fats, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, so what does this reflect for the Chinese population, or how does it dominate China's trend towards its oils and fats consumption? Now, if I looked at the data, China's consumption of oils and fats today is dictated by 5 major vegetables oils. The major consumed oil is actually soybean oil, 46%, followed by rapeseed. Palm oil, imported both from Indonesia and Malaysia, today account for 11% of China's overall consumption. And then the other 2 important consumption oils are sunflower and groundnut. Now, in addition to the 5 major oils, always remember that Chinese diet is very varied. It is historically, it's a traditional diet that is co-imposed by a variety of Chinese dietary habits that is very unique to the Chinese population. Now, despite all this, what we count today is, if we look at the per capita consumption of dietary oils and fats in China, it is reading at about 28 kgs per year per person, or about 76 grams of oils and fats per day. Now, this honestly sits very well into the recommended dietary fat intake, which is about less than 30 energy percent, which is often cited as the optimum quantity of fat for consumption. Now, I use this data to calculate what does a typical Chinese diet look like. The typical Chinese diet today is equated to about 27.6% energy as fat calories, which is still within the 30 energy percent optimum. Now, if I then computed the level of palm oil with the quantity of palm oil imported into China, it works out to about only 8.4 grams of palm oil per Chinese citizen per day, which is equivalent to about 3.1% of their energy intake. Now, the problem that the world tries to express against palm oil is that it is highly saturated. So it has definitely a high content of palmitic acid. Now, if I then calculated what is the SAFA contribution from this level of palm oil in the Chinese diet, it just accounts for a mere 1.5% of the saturated fat consumption, daily fat consumption in China, which is far low. Now, you'd be very surprised to say that everybody flags soybean oil as a polyunsaturated fat high in linoleic acid. But given the quantity of soybean oil that is consumed in China today, do you realize that soybean oil actually contributes more saturated fatty acids per day to the Chinese diet than the palm oil diet? So keep this in mind. Next slide, please. So what does, next slide, what does this all mean? Now, there's a lot of evidence around the nutritional properties of palm oil, and Professor Sun talked about it. But in order to understand its relevance to human nutrition, I count about 38 major human clinical dietary trials that have actually compared palm oil with a variety of fats, saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. These are the real indicators of how palm oil is behaving towards your blood cholesterol levels, or whether it increases or decreases. In this chart, I've actually narrowed down the consumption of palm oil and palmoline versus the monounsaturated oils and fats such as olive oil, canola, rapeseed, and others. Now, in a meta-analysis of this kind, you see a midline running through the graph. And at the bottom, you see two diamonds. If the diamonds sit right at the midline, or they are either far north or far south of the midline, then the target fatty acid or fat that you are consuming has an effect on the parameters of interest. But here you see that you can substitute palm oil for any of the monounsaturated oils, and there is no change in blood cholesterol levels. What it equates is that palm oil is equal to olive oil, is equal to rapeseed oil, is equal to canola oil for its effects on blood cholesterol levels. And there are a host of individual studies already published in the literature that speak prominently about these effects. Next slide. Next slide. Now, the other question that is always posed to me is that, okay, what happens if you and I are continuously exposed to palm oil day in and day out? Do we put ourselves at risk for higher risk of coronary heart disease or other degenerative diseases? This was a burning question, and I partly looked at it in Malaysia, where we tracked a Malaysian population of about 600 people who, in our tracking, we found people who had continuously consumed palm oil for about 15 years. And on a daily basis, they were consuming about 80% of their daily fat intake as palm oil. So if you look at it and equate it to China, this Malaysian population is already consuming 4 to 5 times the amount of palm oil that the Chinese are currently importing and consuming. That's typical in Malaysia. So what was the impact? Now, to measure the impacts in this study, we used rather sophisticated lipoprotein particle sizes, which are a step in advance to the normal LDL, HDL cholesterols that people usually measure. When we looked at it, we found that palm oil consumption over a duration of 15 years in this population at such high levels had no impact on the LDL particle sizes or the LDL concentration, and also on the total cholesterol and HDL cholesterol ratios, which a cardiologist will always measure as to measure your risk. What came out very strongly in this is that risk in the Malaysian population is measured by the quantity of carbohydrates, mainly the consumption of refined sugars that you and I consume in Malaysia. So if we are stupid in Malaysia to consume very high sugary content diet, then it is going to provide us a risk factor or an elevated risk factor. But with any amount of palm oil, you can see that where high fat, low carbohydrate diets, there is no impact. Now, this is a learning exercise, and it's beginning to add a lot of input to the literature. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, that was about effect of palm oil on blood lipids and lipoproteins. Just about 3 months ago, or very recently, there was a lot of noise in the literature regarding palm oil and cancer, because there was a study published in Nature that shows that a mouse fed a diet high in palm oil resulted in pro-metastatic memory in some cells in the mice. And the media went to the hilt and said that you consume palm oil. Palm oil is high in palmitic acid, and it is a cancer risk. The first important thing to learn is that this was a mouse study. It is not applicable in the human scenario, not yet, but the scientific findings are relevant. But how relevant are they for you and me as humans? Next slide. Next slide. Now, there's always been a lot of interest about dietary fats and cancer. And I go back to 1975 to the late Ken Carroll, who I used to also work with. Now, on the left, he documented a relationship between the incidence of breast cancer in a given population. You see that a number of countries were tracked. And what is interesting in this graph is that you can see the Asian populations where low fat consumption was the norm, had lower incidence of breast cancer compared to the Western populations who were at that time consuming 40% of their dietary diet as fat and fat calories. A similar study has come out of Korea, where they looked at gastric cancer, and you can see the relationship between dietary fat intake and onset of gastric cancer or stomach cancer is not apparent in humans. Now, there are so many other examples relevant to the human scenario where cancer is concerned. Let's go forward. Next slide. Now, and then if you look very carefully in the literature, because palm oil was cited from an animal study, I can show you a number of other characteristics where sunflower oil, soybean oil, safflower oil have all been evaluated in mouse breast cancer models or rat breast cancer models, and they were shown to be pro-carcinogenic. And that does not mean those fats are actually triggering cancer. Now, there's also a strong evidence between the quantity of meat and processed meat products that we eat, and the diet has always played an important role in triggering certain pro-cancer events in your body and my body, and we have to be careful of that. So the evidence is very confounding, and I think the summary of the evidence will be, as we know today, next slide, is summarized very nicely in this slide, which is a very authoritative American Institute of Cancer Research guidelines for cancer prevention. Now, if you look at this very carefully, and I looked at this over and over again, I simply looked at, is there anything that says about fat and saturated fat, about palm oil, or even other individual oils in this circle of evidence that has been put out by the American Institute of Cancer Research. There is not a single bit of evidence that associates palm oil, other saturated fatty acids, or other regular oils and fats we consume with cancer. So you must remember that. No doubt the media and the blog articles are very pronounced in this, but the scientific evidence is just not there. Next slide, and this will be my last slide. Now, as a result, in order to address the issue of palm oil and cancer, I put out this. The first thing, and this was published in some local media and on the internet, and again, you can have access to this on the CPOPC blog. The first thing that you need to remember is that palm oil does not initiate cancer. It is not an initiator of cancer. In other words, by eating palm oil, there is not a single ounce of evidence that you will develop cancer. Now, in many animal models, linoleic acid, which is found in soybean oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, etc., has been found to be a trigger for the progression of certain cancers in animal models. But again, you cannot conclude that those are pro-carcinogenic, and therefore you should avoid. We do not advocate this. Now, because even with palm oil, we have published evidence that if you fed palm oil and compare it with soybean oil and etc., the incidence of cancer in the animal model is lower in a palm oil diet. And then another proof of evidence is Prof. Sun talked about carotenes and tocotrienols. Do you know that these carotenes and tocotrienols have potential anti-cancer properties? And we are very interested in this, but there's a lot of work going on. But even with all this evidence, I would say that we are not claiming palm oil to be an anti-cancer dietary fat, but we are simply saying that there is no danger to humans by the continued consumption of palm oil as part of their dietary regime. Let it be for the prevention of coronary heart disease, cancer, degenerative diseases, etc. Next slide, please. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of evidence related to the health and nutrition aspects of palm oil. In fact, there are more than 300 publications in the literature. The literature is very mixed, so you have to filter the evidence, but the evidence, as I filter it and other researchers filter it, it says that palm remains a safe, a versatile oil. And today, with the requirement to produce its sustainability, it meets the requirements of a sustainable edible oil for the world basis. I leave you with that, and thank you very much. Thank you.